meeting of Remediating Political Theory, Repoliticizing Media Theory. And this week we're looking at, well, let me do a screen share. We can look at the syllabus for a minute. So today we're looking at Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, and this was basically a selection of readings that I chose that deal with things like airplanes, bicycles, automobiles, military technologies, weaponry, but it starts with gadgets, and all of this is from Understanding Media. And then the final chapter that I that I chose to include in this selection was the one on automation, which was really fascinating. I want to go back and read it again more closely after this class. So that one, the main reason I put that one here was to go along with Inventing the Future and the emphasis on automation and basic income there. So maybe we'll see some interesting intersections of McLuhan and Chernyshek and Willing. And then Tizian and Terranova, Securing the Social, and Neo-Monadology. These are actually the chapters that she's going to discuss when she meets us on June 12th, which is in 7 days. So we'll discuss that with her then. And then Sheldon Woolen's Politics and Vision, that's an interesting one because of how he addresses media, technology, science, and related themes in relation to the liberal definition of political power, which typically only includes the state, really. Might include the economy as well, but for the most part, liberal political theory is only about the state. So he, as a non-liberal but also non-Marxist political theorist, chose to bring in these other elements, and pretty interesting what he does with it, I think. And then the only other thing that we're going to do today is we'll set aside some time to talk about The Future Left, which is a new project put together by Matthew Donovan and I believe collaborating with Manuela Kolka. So that'll be interesting. So what I'd like to do is to maybe make the presentations and discussions for each one just a little bit shorter than we normally do, so that we can have a little more time to do to discuss the new left, the future left. So I'm just going to do a little calculation here. We have let's just say 5 to 7:30. So we have 2.5 hours. That's 120, 150. Divided by 5. We have 30 minutes for each of these things, basically. And if you guys feel more interested in one of the readings as opposed to the others, we can spend a little more time on that reading and a little less time on another reading. Honestly, Woolen, I think we could do relatively quickly. So if we want to spend maybe a little more time on Inventing the Future, are you pretty well prepared to present on that, Daniel?
Yeah, pretty much. I made like a couple of. I have over here. Can you see me? Because I can't see myself. I don't know if you can.
Let me see.
I can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I only see my default photo, so I don't know if you. Okay, so I have like a couple of slides that I made here to talk about the general ideas of the text. So yeah,
Okay.
If you want to spend more time on it, yeah, it's fine.
Okay, cool. Let's maybe emphasize Chernyshek and Williams, and maybe McLuhan to some extent, and go a little more briefly with Woolen. Unless is anyone else prepared to discuss Woolen in depth? I know. Philip, you know Woolen's work, don't you? Okay, yeah. So perhaps we'll go a little longer with Woolen. We'll see. but either way, I definitely want to have like 30 minutes to discuss the future left. Okay, um, so let's just well, let me go over the readings. I still didn't have time, unfortunately, to uh, I didn't have time to add to this list. I have a bunch of other lists from prior syllabi that I've done that would really fill out this internet section quite a bit, the second half of the seminar. But I'll do that over the coming week. I just wasn't able to, and now I am fully settled into my place. But which is what I thought last time, but then I ended up having to go do a bunch of things just to secure my security deposit and stuff like that. So let's see here. Okay, so for last week we didn't go over this. This one here, Ian Angus, Critical Theory of Digital Media. If you want to, if any of you want to go back and look at kind of a Canadian communication theory, meaning post-McLuhan type of media theory, in relation to digital media, that would be a good place to go. Wendy Brown on online education. Now, the reason I included this one from Brown is that she was criticized by Mackenzie Work, just as Mackenzie Work just criticized Judith Butler for not really doing media theory that well, even though they do political theory and political economy quite well, and also gender theory. But when it comes to media theory, according to Work, they don't seem to really have it together too much. But this is one place where she does actually address digital technology, and it's pretty dismissive about online education. The End of Educated Democracy is also kind of a similar one. The Pleasures and Freedoms of Silence is one that could be used to look at media resistant left melancholy as well. Jody Dean's Why the Net is Not a Public Sphere. So this is one that I could have included in the official readings for this week, but I chose not to because I felt like we already did. We already looked at the public sphere question. But anyone who wants to concentrate on Dean is really one of the best examples of a political theorist who's also a media theorist, and who is just as well known for her media and technological theory as she is for her political theory. So if you had to choose between Dean, Brown, and Butler for media, it would definitely be Dean. She knows it quite well. Richard Grusin, The Double Logic of Remediation plus Premediation. This concept of premediation where events are not just mediated after they've happened or even when they're happening, but they're premediated with news stories that kind of prepare the public for something, very often for war or for something else like that. And I think most of Grusin's arguments about that are focused on kind of negative examples, but there's also positive versions of premediation. And then remediation, for anybody who hasn't heard this term, I think we've discussed it maybe once, but just to refresh your memory, remediation refers to the way that when a new form of media emerges, it brings the qualities of all previous media into relation to the new media. And in Grusin's specific version of this argument, he argues that in his specific version of the argument, he argues that we're going farther and farther with each new remediation. The idea is to try to erase the feeling that we're mediated at all, and to have kind of like an immediate experience, unmediated.
Is that?
Yeah, go ahead.
It sounds a little Hegelian, like the sublating media. Yeah.
How so? Could you say a little more?
Like the sort of the, knowing stuff through mediation until there's sort of the perfect, like, not sort of absence, or not really real absence, but like, sense, kind of intellectualized sense of absence and the sort of the kind of inclusion of one thing, of like method of like knowing something kind of
Right.
to the next. I don't know. Yeah.
No, I see what you mean. It's definitely a dialectical. It's a
Yeah.
dialectical way of looking at media, because for example, I posted I posted an article about Catherine Liu, who teaches at University of California, Irvine. She did some work on selfies, and kind of took to task some of the lighter, puffier arguments against selfies, how they're just meaningless. There's nothing of value to them, and that kind of thing. And and whereas her response was really um, um, when they talked about her work on that, made it look like she was just completely embracing selfies and saying selfies are just pure liberation or something like that. When actually what she was doing was basically like a dialectical media theory, um, trying to think about selfies as both positive and negative in various ways. But
You mean some of like the kind of
mm-hmm. Some of the what?
oh sorry, some of like the sort of pop sociology kind of arguments against selfie culture are just really like so idiotic, like
Yeah.
that they're like narcissistic good. I mean, not really any more narcissistic than anything else. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
It
It's just.
just it just
I
seems
agree.
like something like selfie. Like a lot of people want to say something like provocative about them, and but what they say about them is just totally banal and meaningless.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's always easier to dismiss something, and it always sounds more radical to dismiss something, in my opinion. But I think that that's kind of the easy.
Right.
That's like lazy radicalism, in my opinion.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so the next one is Christine Howe, and this is an article on Simone Weil and the concept of metaxu. I included this one here because I think the internet is kind of a key example of metaxu more than probably any other medium because of its interactivity. Brian Masumi's perception attack. This is a lecture he gave, and in that he's talking about uh, how the military has used kind of preemptive warfare and premediation in a way to prepare the public for various unpopular wars. And then Simone Weil's Metaxu, which we already read. And then for this week, Arthur Croker and Mary Louise Croker. For anybody who likes Baudrillard, Croker is known as basically the Canadian Baudrillard, and he has probably like I don't know 13 or 14 books. Very good thinker. He's pretty dark, similarly to Baudrillard, pretty pessimistic, but he's also a bit nihilistic. So there's if you ever come across Nick Land or you've heard about Nick Land, Croker is very much like Land in his writing style. It's very hyperstitional. It's not just pure like theory in relation to political analysis. It definitely has a fictional quality to it as well. And then Marai, this is Renata Marai. She lives in Melbourne. Her essay Sky High, Skin Deep, which is also about drones. In mine here, for anyone interested in the relationship between Heidegger and Deleuze in relationship to technology, this would be a good one to look at. The political the one by me here, by Adams.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah.
The political ontology of Andrew Nichols Gattaca. If you've ever seen that film, I basically made an argument that Deleuze. I kind of argued that Heidegger was kind of Deleuze's kind of silent partner in at least some of his writing, and I make a case for it. This one down here we read already. Thought Time. 10 years after WTO. I don't have that linked, but I'll get that up there soon. That was one of my first efforts in writing about the relationship between the internet, network-centric social movements that come out of the internet era early on. And then this one here, Paul de Armand's Net War in the Emerald City, is about the Seattle WTO protests, how they used technology, how they were network-centric rather than having one mass group. Was more of a network-centric type of thing. And really what this essay does, and this guy's actually writing for the RAND Corporation, so he's on the side of the military. So basically what this article is a military analysis of the network-centric nature of the Seattle WTO protests. And he makes an argument for why we won in Seattle. I helped organize the Seattle protests back at that time because I lived there then. Yeah, it is really interesting, Theodore. You really should read this. This is probably one of my most recommended readings, especially for the future left and anyone interested in how network centricity relates to politics. It's pretty good. Brassier's Wandering Abstraction. This is dealing with. Let me see. Oh no, this isn't the one I thought it was. Okay, yeah, this is dealing with accelerationism. Butler's The Book of the Machines, a famous science fiction text. CCRU's Swarm Machines, which is Nick Land and company. Manuel Delanda's War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. I almost assigned this one, decided against it in the end because I didn't want to focus too much on war per se, because I feel like we have other people who are focusing on that.
Is it actually having read that before helps me understand the sound affect reading a little. Sure.
Oh, good. So you read that,
yeah.
Delanda? Nice.
Yeah, I had to read it for a class I took on cybernetics once. Yeah.
Oh, cool.
Yeah.
That's great. I'd like to see the rest of the things they assigned.
Oh, you actually I have the syllabus in my email. I'm happy to post it to the group if people are interested.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah.
Okay, this one, Mark Derry, Black to the Future. This is the essay where the term Afrofuturism was introduced. So might be worth looking at if you're interested in Afrofuturism. He's been critiqued partially because he was a white guy coining this term, and then it became the term through which most black science fiction writing was understood. So whether you like it or don't like it, it's still probably interesting to go look at. Fedorov's The Common Task, which is Russian Cosmism. Donna Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto. Chris Hoblis-Gray on the Cyborg Manifesto. And then Catherine Hales. This is her critique of the Cyborg Manifesto. And if you're not aware of N. Catherine Hales, she's often been described as being kind of the successor to Haraway, although Haraway's still alive, and I'm sure Haraway doesn't like that. But she does make some really interesting arguments in this essay where she critiques the Cyborg Manifesto. Amy Ireland, she's she's basically a kind of Deleuzian theorist who xenofeminist Deleuzian in Australia, and she's been working on a dissertation that's almost done on the work of Nick Land, and she's trying to argue that even his current version of his theory, which is neo-reactionary or is somewhat right-wing, very right-wing, arguably, but in a very strange way. She's trying to argue that it can still be used for left purposes, or certain aspects of it can be. Reza Negarestani's Labor of the Inhuman 1 and 2. Nick Chernishek and Alex Williams. Protevi, Outline of War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. I just included this link here because Protevi is a very good analyst and philosopher. So these are basically his notes on War in the Age of Intelligent Machines. And he's someone whose notes I would trust. Derek Gregory, Drones in Late Modern War. And Bogdanov's Red Star, which is, again, Russian cosmism. Okay, so let's start with let's see. Let's just start with inventing the future, because I think that'll set the tone for everything else. Is that okay, Daniel?
Yeah, for sure. So basically, what we had to, well, the text we had to read was the 5th and 6th chapter of Inventing the Future. Okay, the first one kind of sets the tone for the second one, because it makes a kind of analysis of the current situation of the economy, a sort of class analysis based on the progress of technology in the 21st century. And the second chapter tries to propose or give sort of establish a set of prescriptions, I believe, for a future left politics, right? And for kind of the abolition of the basic relationship of capitalism, which is wage labor. So first of all, I'd like to talk about the first chapter, of course, the kind of diagnostic they said. They are constantly insisting on this idea that they formulate about folk politics, which is this kind of token that left has in the present time, where large scale or big scale political action is kind of seen as suspect all the time, and because it, activists and organizations believe that it sort of always leads to authoritarian practices, right? So they kind of set their agenda, or they try to legitimize again. They call the big structural projects or the big structural problems, which are, of course, the classic ideas of taking power or achieving large-scale changes in the world system. And of course, to do this, they have a very interesting proposition, which is recovering the futurist imagination of the left, which has been largely abandoned in the present time. As we all know, there is this whole Soviet tradition of futurism, right, and of trying to imagine life under communism in space and so on. So that kind of tradition is almost totally absent in our days, and is a very interesting aspect, which, for example, to go a little bit out of the topic, Mackenzie Ward also draws upon that tradition in his new book, Molecular Red, which I would recommend highly. So basically what they're trying to do here is to propose a future without work. This means, for me, like four main things. First of all, they kind of denounce what they call a sort of irreversible tendency in capitalism towards the increase of surplus populations, right? So there's like a constant impossibility to produce this social democratic dream of the 20th century, whereby everyone would have a job eventually, right? There would be like full employment. And in neoliberalism, this possibility seems almost impossible, right? So there is this constant tendency of living people in big cities, for example, in the third world, like here in gigantic slums, underemployed, or even in conditions of indentured slavery and new modes of productive work that have nothing to do with the idea of full employment under the welfare state. Secondly, what this produces is a kind of new forms of proletarianization. These new forms have been discussed widely in recent literature, like, for example, with the rise of biogenetics or the rise of social networks, of course, which is a subject more interesting to our seminar. And for example, the working 24/7 working conditions, right, where sleep is the only condition of human life that hasn't been commodified. Third, there are like new or novel long-term structural features which are very interesting, specifically the idea of jobless recovery in the economy, right, and rising precarity. So the economy or the processes of accumulation can recover after several shocks, but that doesn't mean, or that doesn't have as a consequence, more jobs for the people, right? And better prospects for, I don't know, a stable career and so on. So automation plays like a key role in this tendency, because maybe thousands or even hundreds of thousands of jobs become automated, and they allow for a rate of return, once again, for big enterprises, but they don't necessarily give rise to new job spaces for humans, right? They become totally dependent on robots and machines. And finally, they speak about this, the sort of automation as a substitution of human labor force, right? The rise of useless jobs for humans, which are way more limited in quantity and way more limited in salary, right? And this kind of this tendency of automation that speeds up so fast that computers and machinery skills become more rapid, and humans can't keep up with them, right? So for companies, it is easier for some companies, of course, because they will speak about companies which are not kind of they don't see a necessity to automate everything, but machines become more skilled than us in a shorter span of time. Now, maybe what this gives rise for them is that there are, of course, new modes of exclusion, once again, and the possibilities of access to wage labor become more and more determined by technology, right? So we have these classic modes of exclusion of capitalism, especially in the 20th century, of course, race, gender, and other modes of oppression. But now we have like a sort of axis that structures them, or that serves as a sort of center of gravity for them, which is technological automation and technological principles. So what this gives rise to is like a more complex stratification of surplus populations, right? Proletarianization also becomes more, let's say, layered and complex too. So this is what I found very interesting, was they talked about different modes of surplus population, right? The classic surplus population, the proletariat, or what they call the capitalist surplus population. But we also have non-capitalist surplus populations, which live, survive, and work in non-capitalist contexts of production, even if they produce for a specific market, right? Generally, they produce like commodities for specific markets, or I don't know, food industry. Well, not food industry, but modes of food circulation and so on, that operate in non-capitalist context of production, but that nonetheless they work nonetheless for a market. And they also talk about.
Could you differentiate one more time the difference between non-capitalist surplus populations and capitalist surplus populations?
Yeah, I mean, for example, what they call capitalist surplus populations are people that are under a wage labor regime, right? I mean, they go to school, they professionalize themselves, acquire certain skills, and then they go to a company and work there for, I don't know, 8 hours a day and receive a wage in exchange, right? The classic work relationship. But non-capitalist modes of surplus population are more on the side of what many call informal economies, right? So, for example, they uh, um, work in precarious conditions without official permits from the government, and they do an activity that is important for the reproduction of the working class, for example, food, the thing that I was talking about. Um, but they don't do it on a large scale, right? Even though they work for a specific market. Or, for example, I don't know, selling materials to a specific company that uses it to, I don't know, produce shoes or I don't know, several parts of the market. So they organize in sort of small cells of production, which are not essentially capitalist because they don't do that to accumulate capital, but to survive basically, right? They produce a specific commodity and they sell it, and that process is only useful to earn sufficient income to survive, right? Not to accumulate and
Right.
establish an enterprise and so on. And so a large sector of the population is increasingly entering into that mode, right? Of I would call it proletarianization, but what they call post-colonial informal proletarianization, right? And okay, and I don't know if you have any comments or if you'd like
Well,
to like add something.
I'm just wondering how exactly is it surplus though?
Mm-hmm.
Um, what makes these two populations a surplus rather than a necessary component? Because to me, surplus seems to refer to a kind of abandoned
Mm-hmm.
sector. So the ones who are under the wage labor regime, right, is it basically arguing that they are necessary, but they're only necessary as like part timers or
Mm-hmm.
something?
Yeah, I mean, they work under increasingly precarious conditions. I mean,
Right.
they lose their classic social rights that they had, and like they start receiving, like you say, part-time contracts or I don't know, contracts per hour and so on, flexible hours of work. They start working on the weekends and so on. So maybe what I believe that they put them under the category of surplus populations because they don't have this like classic rights, social rights that were operating under the welfare state, right? They
Mhm.
are basically just surviving. There's no safety net that in which they can rely in case they lose their jobs or they can't do that activity anymore. I believe that might be like the most important factor that would make them surplus populations, but I'm not so sure actually. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, they could also be surplus in the sense that the more the automation happens, the more likely it is that they will be completely abandoned, not just
Yeah.
not just not just.
Hmm. Yeah, that too. Yeah, that might be it.
I said not just partially either.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean they're always under the risk of becoming completely useless, right?
Hmm.
To in the eyes of capital. So yeah, that makes them like they say like latent surplus populations, right?
Right.
I don't know if anyone else has something to say about this.
Philip had something to say about it.
Yeah.
Do you want to say that out loud, Philip?
Sure. I mean, I think Nick's analysis of the problem of surplus populations is very close to EndNote's. Aaron Banana and John Clegg, how for example, the current rural to urban migrations in Asia are not reproducing the pattern of the Industrial Revolution, whereby one is kicked off of agriculture and becomes part of the proletariat in the cities, but that in fact they circulate from rural to urban areas and then go back because they're only used on a temporary basis. So they can never find a foothold or be absorbed into a kind of growing industrial workforce, which is always being diminished by things like automation or lack of demand in particular areas, so that they exist in this twilight world and city, so the population. And also the connection to the idea of a surplus population, what Mike Davis calls planet of slums, to this huge industrial reserve army. These people are never necessarily there to be used, but they're there as kind of negotiating players for capital when it deals with the workers that they have, because there's such a large pool of people who aren't even incorporated into work that they can be, they have no leverage or power when they negotiate. So.
Yeah, and that's also important because they kind of lost their organizational power and, like you say, the leverages they had to negotiate, right, with the owners, and so they are totally under the mercy or the will of capital, right? And so, I don't know, conditions of employment are extremely casual, precarious, flexible. I don't know, freelance jobs increase in number and so on. And so there's always like a permanent risk of becoming totally useless and surplus.
Right.
Yeah. And so there's also here a very important difference that I see between this classic, I don't know, Western European and North American modes of proletarianization that they talk about on the one side, and on the other side, what I would call maybe like a sort of post-colonial semi-proletarianization that happens in the global South, right? Where they kind of underline a tendency towards early deindustrialization, right? Where countries in the global South don't wait until they have like a fully established industrial working class when they are already starting to deindustrialize the country and the service sector starts to growing exponentially. So you have a whole chunk of population that like Philip said, travels to the cities, but they don't have enough opportunities, so they come back. They don't have anything else to do in their original places of residence. So many stay in the cities, and so cities become like a extremely disorganized and precarious urban sprawl, where people are like in a sort of weird, I don't know how to call it, like unbalanced situation, because they have been their lands and their main source of living in the rural areas has been taken away, but they also don't have any opportunities in the formal economy in the urban context. So they're like in a state of stasis, right? Where they don't have any mode of subsistence in any place. So they're kind of floating around the cities and trying to survive under extremely precarious circumstances. So there's also like a whole bunch of literature in that subject, which is very interesting because it hasn't been really explored yet, I believe. And that's what they. Let me see my notes here. So yeah, that's kind of the whole context and diagnosis that they make, and they have a very interesting quote that I took here from page 98 that says, in the end, while unemployment measures give us some sense of the size of the surplus population problem, it is precarity, jobless recoveries, and mass urban marginality that truly express the squeeze on the global labor market, right? So the perfect example of this tendency is precisely that semi-proletariat, post-colonial semi-proletariat that lives and floats around the mega cities of the global south without a specific direction or safety net or future, right? Which grows exponentially each passing year. And what this means basically is that in neoliberal times, the idea of full employment becomes almost totally impossible or unimaginable, or even in political context, it's kind of crazy. It becomes crazy, right? In the political consensus, if you speak nowadays about full employment, everyone's going to say, "Well, that's impossible, right? Obviously, that's impossible, and that's crazy." So the overall societal aim, as they say, and I'm quoting here, right, becomes the production of entrepreneurial subjects undergoing constant self-improvement in an endless effort to be deemed employable, right, in quotation marks. So this is what, let's say, in structural terms, justifies the spin towards neoliberalism, right? If structurally speaking, full employment is impossible, then we have to turn around and look to the individual itself and try to self-improve and try to ignore the structural conditions in general, right? And individualize the problem of unemployment, of permanent or constant unemployment, right? So given these conditions, full employment has to be like considered not possible anymore. That's what they say. So this is like the bleak part of their argument, right? Like the very negative part. So what they propose is to create an economy where people don't have to depend on wage labor to survive, right? Because the wage labor relationship is not possible in many senses anymore. And well, that's like their whole proposition about a future of not really non-working societies, but post-working societies, right? What they call post-work. So this revolves around three very basic questions. They call non-reformist reforms, right? Because of course they are very aware that this whole like institutional background of the working class has largely disappeared in many countries, or at least in a large part of the world. So we're not in a position to like propose a full scale and large global revolution, because this is not possible. So basically their whole idea is to talk about this thing that they call non-reformist reforms, which are basically three. The first one is to strain the limits of what capitalism can concede, which means automation is profitable, but it isn't profitable in certain contexts, right? So automation is not going to be widely spread around the world because it is not convenient in certain countries, in certain contexts, etc. So demanding full automation worldwide is sort of dangerous in the end for capital, right? So yeah, this first idea is to demand full automation without taking into account the specific context in which it is made. The second one is to ground demands in real tendencies. And what they mean by real tendencies are the specific aspects that we were talking about, right, in the past chapter. So these real tendencies of permanent semi-proletarianization of the population and of the impossibility of full employment have to be the basis for specific demands that go beyond the wage labor relation and the working culture, which is very important because they spend quite a long time, or at least quite a lot of pages talking about this, the penetration, the great penetration of the working culture that comes from a religious context and so on, instigated by capitalism. And the third part would be to shift the current political equilibrium, right? To build like a sort of new consensus based on the previous reforms or reforming tendencies. So basically on this third aspect, what they're talking about is to propose a sort of UBI, what they call a UBI, right? And I believe, Jason, you published, I think it was a book, or I don't know if it was an article or book about the universal basic income, or the UBI, which is a widely accepted proposition, but it has proponents on the left and proponents on the libertarian right. And in the libertarian right, the universal basic income basically means destroying completely the welfare state or any provisions that come from the state and just giving cash to people and letting them fend for themselves, right? Which is like the final realization of the neoliberal dystopia, I believe. And on the other hand, we have the UBI, or universal basic income, as a mode of kind of as a way of strengthening the very weak welfare state that countries have, at least certain countries, which is kind of now that I'm thinking of it, this should be a point that we could criticize from Chernyshek and Williams, because they believe that the UBI should work as a way of strengthening welfare state, but there are countries in the global south where the welfare state doesn't exist anymore, or never existed in the first place, right? So talking about this is like kind of weird in certain contexts. This proposition says that this basic income should be sufficient to live without having to work, without having to sell your hours or your life or your body to a specific enterprise or whatever place it is, to have to survive, right? So have sufficient provisions to take your time to analyze your options and take the work that you need and that you know that will pay not sufficiently or not enough, but it will give you the most rewards, right? In terms of development of your capabilities and so on. So this is a very interesting point, because they say that this would mean that drudgery, or at least very physical and difficult and the technical jobs would be more well paid, because no one would want to take them, right? And very satisfactory and I don't know, interesting and non-monotonous types of work would be very low paid, because everyone would want to take them, right? And what this would mean is that it would incentivize the process of automation in very difficult and physical works, because it would be more difficult to have, I don't know, 200 or 300 employees or whatever, thousands of employees in a certain industry that would have to be very well paid in order to keep them working in that activity, and you wouldn't have the opportunity to fire them and get more people, because no one would want to take that job. So it would be easier to start automating those activities instead of having people with very high wages. That's like a very interesting proposition, because it kind of makes sense I don't know if it makes total sense in every place in the world. That's what I'm very skeptical about. But it makes sense in the specific context in which they're dealing with. And what this would lead us to is to a sort of fully automated economy. Now, they say that they are conscious, of course, that we cannot have this absolutely fully automated economy, but that at least we can have something resembling that, right? Which would mean to liberate humanity from work, while at the same time producing increasing amounts of wealth. So we would have the sufficient amount of wealth to maintain everyone in decent living conditions, but without having to work as much as we do today, right? And what this means is that the working class, at least, given that they have the sufficient amount of wealth and material conditions to live at least a decent life, their power and their free time can be used to organize politically, and their power can be leveraged increasingly against capital, right? And capital would be constantly and increasingly constrained in the social context. So this is like basically the what they are proposing, and then they speak about the possibilities that this would give to the population in general. For example, they speak about automation not as an economic necessity, because capitalism in general won't accelerate, right, automation based on its inner tendencies, but that rather automation should be a political demand and a very important aspect of every political program in every social movement and political party, which is, I believe, very, very accurate, because automation is something that, at least nowadays, is being totally ignored, or at least it's being looked at in very negative eyes, or in a very negative perspective, right? So people say, yeah, automation is bad because a lot of jobs are going to disappear, and a lot of people is going to be left without work and without money and without any means to live. So yeah, automation is a political demand. At least for me, it's a very important aspect, or a very important thing to rescue from this book. In the second place, they talk about the reorganization of domestic, which is very important, care and reproductive labor, right? And of course, we are used to think of domestic care, reproductive labor, or what they call effective labor, right, as something that should be intrinsically made by humans, because it's kind of, I don't know, humans don't have any feelings, and they wouldn't substitute a mother to a child or something like that. But there are like routine processes that they stress that could be also automated and wouldn't change a lot of our lives, like, I don't know, cleaning our houses every day whenever they're dirty, or doing sort of I don't know, dirty activities like washing our children. I don't know. I'm not sure what they mean specifically with this, but there's also another proposition to even generate artificial wombs, right? To kind of eliminate the burden of carrying a child for 9 months for women, right? And so reproducing ourselves in this, like this movie Man of Steel, right? The Superman movie, where the race of Clark Kent reproduces itself in a sort of gigantic, I don't know, warehouse where they have all the fetuses there growing in artificial wombs, something like that. Another aspects that should be eliminated, or that could be eliminated with this, that I was thinking about, was specifically the commuting times, right? Especially in very big cities, for example, the immense energetical demands required, to maintain long working hours in a very large sector of the population. These energetical demands, which are commuting time, the use of transportation, the use of fossil fuels, and so on, could be immensely reduced, and of course, the carbon footprint in the world would be extremely decreased. And well, all of these are like basically the propositions that they do. And finally, what all of this would mean is a very important question, which would be to change the value of work from its profitability, I mean the condition in which it is right now, to its nature, right, to the nature of the activity, which would be like a totally different vision of work from, of course, the basic vision that it has in a capitalist context. And well, yeah, basically that's it. I don't know if anyone has like any further comments or anything.
So I'm not much they talked about this thing. It made me think a lot about the massive allocation of resources in terms of that not only have we not done this, like it hasn't even been an idea, because so much of the money and time and cognitive energy has been spent especially through technology, sort of to make more profit and more capital flow, even if it doesn't Microsoft will just create a new version of it, so like Windows 10, like for no reason. That's what all the the time and energy and money spent. I guess it just made me think of how I'm obviously going, a massive misalignment, but just sort of the extent of that, what could be done with it, instead of continuing to misallocate time and money, um, you know, innovations more and more. Yeah, I think they talk about it somewhere else in the book. I mean, I haven't read the whole book before, but from what I've heard, I think they talk about it somewhere else. But yeah, do you have anything to say about that, Daniel?
Yeah, I mean, there's like an emphasis on this capitalist tendency towards unnecessary working hours and unnecessary waste of resources, right? And which of course produces like what we have today, like environmental degradation to such a high degree. But yeah, I haven't read the whole book, so I don't know if they go deeper into that matter.
I guess one thing I was just thinking about is I think one stumbling block for a lot of people, whether they're sort of in theoretical or leftist or both or neither context or not, is just sort of the sort of the capitalist realist mindset of just that the way things are allocated right now is just sort of, that's just kind of how how things work. Like it's not possible to allocate them any other way without causing some sort of like worse crisis or something. So it's just
like food, for example, which is intensively produced by the agro-industrial complex, but it is not produced to feed the people, right, but to create profit. So if 40% or 30% of the whole food that has been produced is not sold, then it is just thrown away to the garbage, and that's it, right?
Right, and even food that is sold, at restaurants, and settings and everything like that. There's a tremendous amount of very quality food that goes to many people and able to feed them.
Yeah, Adam, I don't think that Nick and Alex have a very strong vision of how to cross the river of fire that one would have to go through, considering the opposition at every level,
Right.
all of which is reasonable. But rather than, my first tendency was to dismiss it as utopian. Not now when I read it, but when I first encountered it. But
Right.
I think what they made me realize was the importance of having a vision and having a claim to a different future. Because when neoliberalism under Thatcher and Reagan came in, it didn't look like the future to any of us. It looked like a return to social Darwinism. There was nothing particularly new. And yet,
Right.
it did present itself as something new and was accepted as a kind of innovation economy. And suddenly, the left was consigned to, particularly when they were trying to preserve elements of the welfare state as opposed to letting the economy rift and rain down its manna from heaven as it would when it was unleashed, and the rising tide would lift all boats and all that kind of garbage. And it which still persists in the kind of new Web 2.0, 3.0 mentality, where the tech companies, instead of Heidegger's God that's going to save us, it's the tech companies and innovation, and which they've adopted as a mission. So the importance of setting out a different claim on the future is very important, and as a part of, let's say, combined and uneven struggle. Where some people, or let's say Joshua Clover, dealing with riots on the street, is dealing more directly with confrontation with what's going on now, but at the same time, in helping to reform the imaginary of the left, I think what Nick and Alex are doing is very valuable, particularly in the way that they, for example, have re-examined the socialist calculation debate, or cybernetics in Russia, or attempts with kind of not up to snuff technology to do things which post-Walmart's logistic might be possible. So I think as the kind of research arm, or the Mount Pelerin of the left, I think they're creating a very valuable institution. And I also think that their distinction, their refusal of the hard and fast distinction between revolution and reform is essential for the left to make any kind of progress. The idea of revolutionary reforms, which I think was first proposed by Andre Gortz in New Left Review about 15 years ago in an article I'll try to post, said basically there's a difference between the kind of reforms that are kind of one-off and are for alleviating, and those reforms which are part of a linked sequence of reforms that have an effect of dissolving the system, that operate as a kind of a chink wherein something gets in that starts to corrode and is resisted, but is so innately reasonable that it's very, very hard to resist. And it's important to think about that every time, a Chavez or an Allende or even a Bernie Sanders comes in as a kind of, and makes a kind of opening. How can you expand that opening? How can you create a series of teachable moments that will make it wider and lead to the next thing that will ultimately destroy capital? So those are my thoughts.
I have a quick question for those that are more sort of well-versed in accelerationist theory. What is their response to the Anthropocene, to the environmental catastrophes that I think you just mentioned, Danielle? because it occurs to me that the demand for full automation will be placing more demands on energy consumption to leave the leisure time open. So the surplus populations might have more leisure time, but they might be living in worse circumstances environmentally going forward. Is there a kind of response to that, or something contained in the book? Does it address that?
It's, yeah, I was wondering the same thing. I mean, although there is, I mean, just work in general, and all these sort of unnecessary work and, commute time and everything, I mean, does definitely use, like, a lot of, fossil fuels and everything. So, I mean, that would solve some of it, but it would still, I mean, I see what you're saying, it would still not, there would still be a lot kind of, um, left unaccounted for.
I've I've heard that the argument for the technological side, um, but from people that are pro technology, that um, global warming will be in some ways truncated by technological advances. Um, Jason or Philip, have you guys heard anything about this in relation to accelerationism, or is anybody else familiar with this?
About which aspect? I'm sorry.
Even recognize
I guess I was trying to envision what an accelerationist environmentalism would.
Well,
how could
exactly. That's what I think. Well, if you say if you're pro technology, then you would to help, as opposed to inherently detrimental to the environment. Response really. And I was just seeing if anybody else had anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I would say is that, first of all, in terms of the commuting portion, if we have basic income and everything is automated, how does it balance out in terms of no longer having such a great need to commute every single day, millions or billions of people around the world? If you no longer have to commute, and you can just kind of, maybe you would live in a walkable neighborhood, or you would, do work from home, kind of like the New Center. With the New Center, we've kind of automated commuting in a way to the classroom. So, is there a reduction in the fossil fuel harm, on the environment due to the fact of automation? Possibly. And how does it actually balance out? I'm not sure how it would for sure, but it seems like that could be a positive thing.
And also, so many, so many of the machinations of the free market are so rough on the planet. Just with for example, when like things that were like in the United States will be flown to China, something's like can be packaged cheaper and then flown back, or that's sort of, needless transport back and forth, not for distribution of your trading, but for cheaper labor, or getting around tax loopholes and all that kind of thing. That's like a tremendous amount of but yeah, I mean, again, I don't know exactly what difference that would make, but probably make some difference.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'd love to see some studies, if there are, if those exist, about that. that also weigh the kind of the environmental costs of like things like data. Is that what they're called? Data centers, servers, data servers, with greater reliance on internet, connectivity.
Yeah.
I've heard that one data server in one building consumes energy to the scale of like a small city. But that's informal. I'd be curious to see some more scientific kind of studies about that.
And there's also the question of how the energy is being produced, because like Facebook, for example, in Oregon, wherever their headquarters is completely reliant on coal. So Facebook is a very dirty, environmentally a very dirty technology. But it doesn't. I don't know. Maybe it doesn't have to be coal. Maybe it could be something else, and then it wouldn't be quite so impactful.
Yeah, I just think it would come up naturally. I mean, that would be like a high priority question in terms of like envisioning or inventing the future. Is just sustainability.
Yeah,
absolutely. Unfortunately, I did hear recently that the price of oil has been dropping. Kind of depressing, because then there's going to be more, more push to continue with, oil and gas and such. But
one interesting notion of even thinking about the car, which people tend to talk about in technical terms, about are you able to automate it and so forth, is to try to think of the role that the car plays, at least in American life, not in terms of the mythology of advertising, or not totally, but when you think that for Americans of modest means, the two moments of freedom that they have in their lives when they're not at work or so forth is when they close that car door and they're alone and they have agency behind the wheel driving somewhere, or when they pull a trigger on a gun on a range. And one has to substitute those, if one wants to get rid of them, as we certainly do, to provide substantive realms of freedom that don't exist for the people who emotionally, to a certain extent, have anchored and invested so much in these two media.
right.
and there are certain forms of technological change that could greatly reduce our need for fossil fuels. Like, for example, the driverless car I mentioned in the in the comments. I just heard a figure last week that the prediction is that the driverless car, if it is implemented in mass, will mean that people will not need to own their own cars. And if people don't need to own their own cars, then we would probably see, a pretty massive reduction in just the ownership of vehicles, and then, which to me would probably result in a much lowered kind of just sporadic, impulse use of the automobile as well.
Right, which is good. I mean, it'd be nice to find a way to sort of reduce the, use automation to reduce, all the, violent impact of fossil fuels without restricting people's, movement too much. 'Cause, I mean, it's easy to, try to automate things enough, people don't have to like leave home that much or that kind of thing. But I mean, that's that's not a good solution, not a good thing either. So, I mean, obviously, I guess using, more people using public transportation is one thing. I mean, part of why more people don't is just logistic, but I also think, like you said, Philip, part of why, some people are just attached to the car rather than public transportation, even when it's available to them, because it seems like one of the few points of autonomy for them that are possible. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it might be like a weird or even silly example, but imagine this an automated Uber pool like modality of transportation, right? Whereas people that enjoy riding a car take this Uber pools all around the city, and then they just travel without having to drive in anything. So it kind of decrease a lot, I believe, the use of cars around the city. Or, for example, the idea of the universal basic income serving people to at least buy everything they need to eat, right? So a lot of food that just goes to waste because no one can buy it really, right? Would be
Yeah.
I don't know, immensely decreased, I think.
Yeah, and I guess in the meantime, it would be nice to find a way to, more rationally and humanely allocate the food, the excess food that there is to people who can't afford food. I mean, hopefully in the future we won't be, sort of making so much unnecessary food, but like for the time being, with uh, you know, all the food and people who aren't eating. It just, yeah. I think France recently has forbade its supermarkets from throwing out uh, edible, relatively fresh food that wasn't sold, and they have to donate it to, like, food pantries or whatnot. So I guess that's a step in the right direction. Sorry, Jason, were you about to say something?
No, I don't think so. But we should probably transition into the discussion of the future left because we've been on this for about an hour. We did say that we were going to set aside the largest portion for this book, so that's fine. But it just seems to me that the discussion of the future left would dovetail with this really well. So might as well just do it now. So let's talk about that for maybe 30 minutes, and then we'll move on to the other readings. You want to go with that, Matthew?
Yeah. So kind of building off what Philip was just talking about, and going off a lot of the work of, I think I might try to relocate. There's crying babies right now. So we're creating an organization based off a lot of the things that we're talking about today. For instance, Jody Dean.
You're breaking up a little bit.
Can you hear me better now?
Yeah, I think maybe.
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. You guys can hear me? Okay.
From every walk of life,
Okay, great. So we're creating a reading and thinking group, like a proto think tank, basically as an extension of a lot of the things talked about at the New Center, inspired by the New Center as well, to bring the practice element to a lot of the theory that we've talked about, So it's at the intersection of experimental, critical, and theoretical practices. Through the we're also looking so movement of the left and a more global, technological, and future-oriented direction. So yeah, we'll be engaging thinkers like Chernyshek and Williams. And so yeah, we're just trying to challenge the notion that that movements like the one centered around Bernie Sanders is the answer for the future. So a lot of the critique that Daniel was talking about, activism, a little short-sighted, and it's putting emphasis on the local and the libidinal of the local, and thinking more in the global and embracing the technological. We just posted something on our page yesterday from Peer Research showing, for instance, that 50% of jobs in 10 years is projected to be cut short by some automation. And this will lead to things like massive inequality, and I'm sure a lot of you are aware of like what kind of disruption in the social order this would create. So you won't hear any of these things being talked about by the majority of activists. And why aren't these things being talked about? This is a serious push immediately. So we're partnering with the New Center. We're also people working on getting this in the public school in LA, where I am, and the public school in Berlin, and a proposal into a radical queer festival in Montreal, where it seems that this will be presented. And so at this point, it seems that anybody that's interested will be able to be involved in a New Center-like class. We're trying to work on logistics, on how to get 15 plus people involved. And so Manuela, who's also in this class, will be facilitating in Berlin. And did you want to add anything to this, Manuela? I know you're really tired. And don't think you had too much to add to this.
Well, I mean, what I think is a great idea and a great approach, which is already like, of course, like, you know, implemented by the New Center, but to kind of like bring this also down to like the local spots, but then nevertheless like achieve more synchronization, and not just like in Google Hangouts, but to like somehow maybe like mediate like also like even like take it a step further and combine like the physical meetings with the mediation. So not like that everybody, like even with more like local group meetings or something like that. It's just an idea which I thought like was already like pretty well like implemented by the public school like format, that, you know, there's somebody has an idea in a certain city, and then you can basically take this similar idea and take it to your place. So it's kind of like a combination. It works on like several levels in terms of organization, and I think this is something that should definitely be, you know, discussed further, especially in terms of like reaching the global scale and taking on like different levels. That's what I can say right now. Yeah, logistics is.
Yeah, we were talking about trying to make this available in more cities. So if anybody would like to get involved wherever you are, we're going to create basically like an easy run through, so that like a program basically, so that if you want to host this, you you wouldn't have to do too much thinking, basically. You would just have to do the organizing and get people together and that kind of thing. Because this should be happening everywhere. We should be thinking about this experimentally and critically everywhere, so that we can have the same kind of momentum that Occupy had, but having it a more critical mass around technology and the globality of what's happening right now.
So would it be kind of like a futurist version of Occupy?
Can you say that, James?
Oh,
Jason?
I said, so would it be like a futurist version of Occupy in a way?
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, it would be a futurist version of Occupy. I love that.
Because
Yeah.
Occupy was very spatially oriented in terms of like occupy this space, whereas like you guys are talking about raising the question of these future oriented concerns that are not really being addressed in activist communities.
Well,
And
occupying the digital space, extending it, like not only thinking the physical, but also like in terms of communication networks, in terms of communication space, right? I mean, that's what the class is about.
well, I think that the template model that they developed, where first there was Occupy New York City, then there was Occupy LA, then there was Occupy Chicago, and soon there was an Occupy everywhere. That itself is in form, the actual form of it was kind of futurist, but the subject matter, the content was not futurist for the most part. So I think you guys could do a lot of really great things. It sounds very exciting.
Working on it.
Would it be accurate to describe it as kind of, trying to be like trying to figure out how to implement some of the ideas in inventing the future? And I guess what I'm asking is, like, in what ways do you think that could happen? Like, for example, would you guys be organizing around basic income, trying to get, for example, maybe cities to to at least do some experiments with basic income? Like, what kind of practical activities do you want to be involved in?
I think UBI is probably certainly a topic to discuss, especially because it is something that needs to be discussed globally. I mean, Switzerland just rejected like the proposal, which certainly, does have an impact also maybe on other European countries or wherever else it is proposed. I mean, this is going to be very interesting. It's now also heavily discussed in Germany, so this is definitely like bringing in these topics is absolutely essential, of course. Or I don't know what you think, Matthew. Can you hear us, Matthew?
I think he's kind of frozen.
Okay.
This is the future right here, is being frozen in the midst of conversation.
Who knows why, right? Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, what I can say is we can keep you up to date. I mean, I'm just gonna speak for Matthew now, I guess. There's like a Facebook group to keep you up to date here, and again, it's in the working and follow up and propose anything. If you have anything you want to contribute, get in touch.
Cool.
I can say.
Well, does anyone, do you want to say something more about that, Theodore? Or does anyone else want to talk about these ideas? I mean, the other way to think about that, aside from the future left itself, would be, to me, would be the question of, how could we practically get some of these things to happen that they're calling for in inventing the future? Is there a way to do that? Like, what would be even just the very first steps, for example?
Philip, you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was going to say this doesn't answer Jason's question, but I sent both Matthew and Manuela a thing about Red May as the notion of being which is an event I'm doing in Seattle, but which I want to be connected with other things going in the world, around the world next year, and we might be able to figure out a way for what you guys are doing to be part of it, or to be linked with Berlin and LA or whatever as it's going, and try to figure out a way, as you say, to commingle physical presence of people in this city with what's going on in your cities. Maybe it's Red May Berlin and Red May Los Angeles as well as Red May Seattle. So, and I'm going to send other people here too, probably at the end of the thing, what the event is, because I'd love to figure out a way to work with all of you guys.
Yeah, I think we lost Matthew right now, so yeah, I don't know if you should just go on or if anybody else has any questions.
Peter, could you verbalize some of that so that we can have more of a
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Can you guys hear me? I think my signal might be really bad. No, yeah, I guess this sounds maybe just banal in how practical it is, but I think one of the perks of the visibility that an internet platform offers is that you can start to organize in spaces outside of the internet much more easily. And we all have a sense of each other's presence in other spaces too. It's so common sense, but I think in reality it works really well.
Yeah, like for example, right now Theodore's in Grand Rapids, and pretty soon one of the other people from the new center is going to be here. I mean, that kind of stuff happens all the time, right? Like for those of you in California, I'm sure that for example, Avind and Matthew are probably not too far apart physically. You could potentially meet, and maybe this kind of a thing where there's some practical activity like that could be an impetus for it.
Totally. And I was just going to say, I actually ran into another new center member yesterday, Olivia, in LA, and it was very cool to meet in person. So, and we talked about this subject. This, cool. Or actually, she had told me about this project before. So, I think that's probably in the cards that we'll gather in person and come to the meetings.
Nice.
And I was also going to mention that I think there's been a kind of similarly structured movement in improvised music for, I don't know, at least 10 years, where small ensembles of musicians kind of meet at the same time and improvise. And I heard it's getting really good technically, that it can sound very good, so it actually takes place in venues, multiple theaters. And I think Mark Dresser at UCSD is doing this most of the time. I'll just write his name down. Dresser. Improvised music in different locations. I don't know what maybe it's a more formal title.
So this is kind of like a flash mob or something?
I think it's just a format where it sort of doesn't matter where the other musician is that you want to play with. You can just do it like we're doing now over Google Hangouts.
Right.
But they use a PA system, and it apparently it works.
Huh.
I've never been a part of something like that, but
well, there is a studio mode for Google Hangouts, and as long as you don't have too many people at one time, you have a very good connection or whatever. I've heard some of the music that has streamed over Google Hangouts very high quality when you use studio mode. So,
cool.
Yeah, that could be great.
Yeah, and I'd be really interested in pursuing something like that in locations that are politically kind of off limits, like North Korea. If there was a community of improvisers over there that could participate, for example, or any number of places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be amazing. That's something. Somebody who would be interested in that, by the way, Vend, is Merv Berdier. I'm not sure if you're friends with her on Facebook.
No.
I'll type her name in. Merv Berdier. And she actually did exactly that in where was it? It was actually in China. She said that there were the place where she was pretty heavily policed, and you couldn't have gatherings of more than a certain number of people. But they were basically just doing like art education, but with a critical theory kind of element to it as well. And she had said that she wanted to work with the new center to try to do more of that kind of thing. So she would be a good person. It was a city that's pretty near Hong Kong, but I can't remember the name of the city. So.
I'm definitely interested and supportive of these ideas, and I'll definitely take part.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think the future left idea, I really like it, and I think that really I really think that Occupy was futurist in form in terms of how they did it, but it wasn't futurist in terms of content. So I wonder if there's something that could be retained from Occupy, maybe build on whatever was good about it, discard what wasn't good about it, and then infuse it with totally different content, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think that they've invented a language and a terminology, kind of, I guess, nomenclature and a grammar, I guess, of discussing it. And that's why, even though I was skeptical and sort of continue to question the technophilia aspect of it, but I still am excited by the whole accelerationist language, and it's gathered. A lot of people have gathered together around that language.
Yeah. Looks like you're coming in much clearer now, Matthew. Do you want to say any final words?
The basic it wasn't just fulfilling the politics of inventing the future, but I think that we should go further and in all of our separate spaces try to think as we want, kind of thinking in those terms.
I couldn't hear a fair portion of what you just said.
To structures wait from that. So can you hear me?
Yeah. But for a while,
Okay.
you were like coming in and out. So.
Am I still coming in and out?
Now it seems a little more stable. But.
Okay. So basically, we want to. Okay.
You want to what?
Yeah. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's arrange another hangout later on. I don't know if Matthew's on his phone, he might not be able to see that.
Okay.
But I don't know if he's on his phone or if he's on his laptop.
Yeah, I think attending another hangout to hear about it if we can have better signal.
Yeah, why don't we schedule a hangout, like a group hangout, to talk about this in more detail?
Yeah, exactly. Like, because it also will probably take some time to like just infrastructurally organize everything, also with the public school and so on and so forth. So maybe let's give it a little bit of more time, and then we can like discuss more substantially, hopefully.
Sure. Yeah, that'd be great. Well, in any case, it's very exciting and seems like the obvious thing that nobody thought to do until now. So it's great.
Let's do it.
Cool. All right, so let's move on to. I think I'm gonna. I mean, I have a bit of a presentation to talk about, but let's move on to. Let's move on to Terra Nova. Do you want to talk about Terra Nova, Anwala?
Okay. So the thing is, I did the neo-monadology, and I just did the other text today, and I think I'm going to do the securing the social, Foucault and social networks first, and then I'm going to do the neo-monadology because it actually it's kind of interesting, and I'm actually wondering, do you know which text she has written, like in which chronology the texts were written? Was she writing the Foucault text before the other one? Do you know this, Jason?
No, I don't actually know.
Because I think, I mean, that this is kind of like my guess. Or this is maybe like a good way, like a good order to read the text in. Because in the first text, she's basically looking into how like the civic society basically comes into place, which kind of mechanisms of security and surveillance are operating. She's diving into like Foucault. I'm going to go more into detail in a bit. And then in the other text, and then of course she's looking into like what the mechanisms are in digital social networks and social media and so on and so forth. And then in the second text, in the neo-monadology, it feels to me like she's going more in depth into like what cooperation, like social cooperation, really means, like how value is produced. She's more looking like into like the economic aspects of it, which she was touching in the security text, but in the second text, the neo-monadology is inquiring more in detail into that. So just as a recommendation for reading for those who haven't.
Yeah.
Right. So so the first text, so Terra Nova's main investigation here addresses the ways in which the social networks are intrinsically enmeshed in market economy and forms of self-regulation, surveillance, security, and governmentality, fitting neoliberal terms. And second point, how contemporary social networks, quote, could be seen as not only supporting market-conforming government, but also allows for the intervention that socialist art of government that Foucault denounced as missing. So this is like basically what he describes as the outset, and maybe also like is kind of like the question that remains throughout the whole text. And an analogy of Foucault's reference to Bentham's panopticon, a specific organization of visibility. That's the idea of the panopticon. She shows how the domain of the social, which has previously been largely ignored as a site for governmentality, has not only slowly become the domain of disciplinary mechanisms of governance, policy interventions, accounting, and so on, and the like, and an object of the state's gaze, but a domain which can be known through means of sentiment and analytics and various types of social analytics in real time, also known as big data today. And she briefly mentioned in reference to Rosie Braidotti that this shift from qualitative to quantitative analysis marks a decline of theory in humanities research. That's just like on the side note, something I was also working on. Terra Nova turns the focus onto Foucault's two lectures, which is Security, Territory, and Population from 1977-78, and The Birth of Biopolitics from 1978-79. As a reminder how theory has practiced socially half a century ago, like in the sense of physically, which can like connects to like what we were just talking about. She just mentions like how people were literally coming together to do theory, like physically, and she describes how Foucault, as opposed to like the digital practices, like what we're doing right now, and she describes how Foucault analyzes the emergence of biopolitics as a technology of power that supplemented and displaced the centrality of disciplinary mechanisms with a new type of mechanism of power, security. This I'd mentioned, and she actually mentions that also later on, stands very much in line with Deleuze's postscript on the Societies of Control from 1992, which also builds on Foucault as well, of course. And Terra Nova intends to avoid, in fact, actually like a too simplistic reading of social network sites and social media as a mere panopticism. So she's rather interested in the relation of dispositives of security and the construction of the relation between the market and society as correlates of a technology of government. So she's really trying to go beyond like the kind of visibility or security and transparency and so on, and just investigates like how this works together, like market and society, in order to like get a grip on the security and government, like security, notions of security in terms of governmentality. And in order to ensure security, security supplements, transforms, and displaces previous mechanisms of power. This is what she describes. Basically, she lays out what Foucault is talking about in these lectures. And that is, whereas legal and juristical mechanisms operate merely along a binary code of that which is prohibited and that which is not prohibited, disciplinary mechanisms of power introduce a third entity, the culprit, as it's called, who falls within the domain of surveillance, diagnosis, and the possible transformation of individuals. So that's actually a rather decentralized mechanism, something psychoanalysts like Zizek would call the big other, just to add to like this notion. And these mechanisms, or correct me if I'm wrong, but these mechanisms are transferred. She goes on. These mechanisms are transferred from a mere spatial or physical arrangement to control movement to the digital sphere with digital social networks and the like. But the problem of security remains the same, which is essentially one of circulation. Like if it's a physical movement or just modes of communication and access, it remains a similar problem. So networks, she also describes networks want to expand according to a movement that Foucault called centrifugal. In digital networks, though, this happens without elimination, error, and loss. So at least that's how I understood it. It sounds like digital networks are more and more efficient in epistemic and economic capture, like epistemic in the sense of like just like capturing knowledge. Like it's kind of archived, documented. It's directly integrated into the network, and market and society as two correlates of power or transactional realities for Foucault don't exist objectively or universally, but they can also not be dissolved into just some construction. So this is kind of like like when you speak about the capture, this is where market and society kind of manifest or correlate in terms of power in these networks. So they're not separated. It's not that, oh, we have just society and market and it's something different, but it kind of is enmeshed. So she goes on laying out Foucault on the relation between civil society, state, and market. So Foucault asserts in The Birth of Biopolitics, quote, "The neoliberal market as formal structure of competition is remarkably different from the liberal market as site of exchange. Liberalism has emerged from a critique of the state of police, as Foucault points out, which points out to the sovereign as a kind of reality which exceeds his power, meaning economic processes and events, but also naturalness, which is specific to relations between men, to what happens spontaneously when they cohabit, come together, exchange, work, and produce." So this is so he basically speaks about, yeah, like how cooperation basically comes into place. So civil societies are described as supporting and sustaining economic processes. So they're not just like subject to it, but they also exceed economic processes. And she further kind of opposes the idea of the homo economicus, where the market works as resembling individual interests into a general interest. Civil society is mediated in purely economic terms. She mentions Adam Ferguson and Adam Smith, and that maximum profit is trying to achieve from exchange. So that's one version, and the other version is, or on the other side, there's like disinterested interests, instinct, sentiment, and sympathy, impulses of benevolence. So these are like the two, kind of parts which come together. And civil society, in contrast to the market, operating on a global space, refers to limited and particular ensembles, amongst others, not humanitarian, but in a communitarian mode, according to Ferguson. So, and then she goes on to describe that civil society is based on the socius. Socius is Latin for companion, or the one who follows. So, which reminds us of like Facebook friends. You can follow somebody or you cannot. So this is like the way how the civic society or social networks are created through like this kind of accompanying mode. And civil society also is described as a mediator of cold market mechanisms. So it's described as like being like the buffer, and it's kind of like or maybe making the market impact like being able to like make or enabling people to cope with the effects in whichever kind of ways maybe. And Terra Nova tries to show how social networks express a model of society which, on the one hand, complies with Foucault's terms, with disinterested interests and partial affinities, patterns of empathy, etc., of civil society, while on the other hand being subjected to the operation of mechanisms of security or Deleuzian control, like in Deleuzian terms. Digital networks are described as an extension, or she's asking basically the question if digital networks are supposed to be understood as an extension of the economy into the social, or in Marxist terms, the subsumption of the social under capitalist modes of production. So she's trying to like, yeah, like find out like maybe what is like how much is or maybe how much agency kind of these social interactions or social networks have in relation to economic processes. And in the next section, Terranova goes on to describe the underlying infrastructure of edges and vertices, points and lines of graph theory. So she's kind of trying to show how these networks are implemented in social networks in relation to social network analysis, and how they and the implementation of social media infrastructure seem to correspond to the extension of mechanisms of security to the fabric of social relation as such. And in the end, like, I'm not going to go into detail with that really, but in the end, she's kind of saying that, or that's her conclusion, that she thinks that maybe Foucault doesn't really leave much of a way out. So in terms of looking for alternatives, and she's basically like resuming or ending with this precise question, like what's the alternative, like what I mentioned in the beginning. Like, are we kind of like is there no other alternative, or can we like, is there a way to like somehow change those dependencies maybe, or these market conforming processes of governmentality in a sense, like through the digital modes of social networks. Yeah, so that's part one. That's like the first article. If you have any questions already, Jason?
It seemed to you that she is taking that question seriously throughout the essay, or does it seem like she just kind of raises this at the end after describing Foucault's theory and then applying it to the digital? I mean, for sure, there are so many examples of control and securitization in terms of digital culture and online culture, but I think there's a difference between, like, if you write an essay like this, where the whole point of writing it is really to try to draw out possible alternatives or possible future directions, and or the alternative being you really are more on the pessimist side, and you might raise that question, but for the most part, you're kind of describing how things are right now. Do you feel it was more descriptive or prescriptive?
Yeah. Like for my, like, I thought it was more of a, drawing out like the genealogy of maybe like what kind of mechanisms are where she was kind of just trying to like get a grip on like the social process, like this, like maybe trying to be able to draw a line, which I don't even know if it's possible, but to like see like what are the social processes, what are the economic processes, and I'd say like this is much more like there can be, there's more to be to find about the production of value and these kind of things in the neo-monadology. That's why I thought, okay, this is more like trying to get a grip on what is the question, what are the issues, how does this really manifest maybe, and then that's why like the neo-monadology I think offers maybe a little bit more, but it's also maybe a slightly different reading. It brings in more like other resources, I'd say. So it's kind of like maybe trying to find a way like to articulate like the question in the precise way, because just asking about, like, I mean, otherwise you can end up with the banal realization, yeah, well, of course social and market or economic processes are intertwined. So so maybe the question then remains also, is it rather like a question of media, or is it a question of is it a political question? Like how do these, like, where do these meet? And I think she was just trying to get a grip on this, like, in a way, which I think is helpful anyways. But yeah, I don't know if that answers.
Yeah. this. Like she's setting the stage for some future thing, and maybe she raised that question because that's what her next essay was going to be.
Yeah, in a way. Okay, so and I read the second one, the neo-monadology. I actually read first, and then I read the other one. So I have like exactly the opposite experience. But okay, so in the second, in the neo-monadology, Terranova starts out with an investigation on how social memory is created within the digital networks. So first she shows how social media networks react to, for instance, like she brings in this example of the death of a well-known person or like, I don't know, medium celebrity in Italy, a collective recall of I think it's a guy, like his music, and she names like the example of his death, the death of Pino Daniele, which I've never heard of, on the 5th of January 2015, which has gained a lot of attention in the Italian-speaking community, you know, kind of like almost like a local community phenomenon, as being expressed on Facebook walls and other social media networks, which led to a massive gathering for his funeral on the 7th of January 2015. So basically, a socially mediated um, uh, public memorization, which then turns into like a physical gathering, right? So it's like this kind of, this is kind of the process that she describes, and she recognizes this kind of memorizing creates value, like for instance through suggestions, suggesting algorithms, generated views on YouTube. It's raising income streams for telecom operators, etc. And it produces the flow of information and thereby becomes a direct productive force in the economic domain. So she kind of goes from this example like the digital, like this memorization to the physical, and then she's wondering about the production of value. So do we? So and then she kind of wonders. So do we, when memorizing, contribute to the social production of value in a capitalist society, or is this form of memorizing, recalling, and redistribution to some extent exempt from the production of commodity value? And then she kind of like goes on and just like presents two stories or two readings of the social production, or of social production in relation to cooperation. And one is that where she brings in what's his name, Benkler. She brings in Benkler, who basically describes the production of value. He basically mentions that the production or the corporation and the following creation of economic value in a network society comes off happens automatically. So social production is based on the coordinate effects of non-coordinate actions, in as much as one does not need to be consciously cooperating in order to be actually cooperating. So he's kind of like bringing in this notion of well, we're cooperating anyhow, and through that, like one could think, well, this is how value is created. So it's kind of the first point she brings in. So she's wondering about the aspects or the extremes spanning between the mechanical and the non-mechanical cooperation, or social or P2P production. And she's wondering about it's basically about questioning, and she brings this in also later on, where she opposes like cooperation as almost like coming into into place through individual actions or individual decisions, or is it not something that happens, automatically? So this is why she brings in these examples. And she goes on and brings in post-workerist Marxist theory, following Marx' Grundrisse, in which they've argued that social cooperation is not simply a new source of value, but a specific historical expression of living labor in an economy defined by the hegemony of immaterial value production and financialization. And social cooperation is involved at every stage and throughout every layer of value production in post-industrial economies, involving not simply the completion of a task and the reproduction of a template, but the production of new values and the socialization of invention. So this is what she adds here. She further goes on also with references to Paulo Virno and Simondon's philosophy, that the common or the social is pre-individual. So it's kind of like, this is like that which through which cooperation comes into place. It's something that already exists, but at the same time, that reserve of being which allows the individual to undergo also new transformations. And then she even goes on to Maurizio Lazzarato, who's posing autonomous and independent social cooperation as the ontological and historical presupposition of economic valorization and division of labor. Basically, the social as the precondition for the economic. Through also through mnemonic work like memorialization and the labor of attention. The cooperation, in fact, she brings in with Lazzarato, is social insofar as it is not founded on work or capital, but on the activity of the spirit, soul, or memory. So so it's a little bit difficult to follow the little nuances here, but because she's investigating memorialization on the one hand, then she's looking into cooperation. What is cooperation as such? And then you also have the underlying layer of society, or so the social versus the economic, right? So it's a little bit enmeshed here, how these what's actually always the focus. But she's asking then, okay, if value is first of all social production, mobilizing the powers of memory, in what way is it reconfigured by the digital networking of the social, by the ubiquitous social activity of recording, storing, and sharing? And yes, and then she brings in the neo-nomadic, which is actually a theory of based on Leibniz concept of the monad, which is a monad has no windows according to Leibniz, and everyone is basically a monad, which is not really an atom but a cell. So it does kind of contain it has a space in a sense, and the metaphysics works in the sense that we're able to maybe communicate in a way, because there's a sameness within in each monad, and through that there's kind of a recognition, that the process of recognition or communication happening. This is a very reductive version of that. So she kind of tries to compare or look into also theories of the individual, the individual and the monad, and she's trying to also trace this kind of genealogy of understanding like the individual as a unit, or the individual as like a node, or in the Deleuzian sense. And she's trying to understand how this actually, this is kind of like a model that can be applied or works with digital networks in a sense of, are we all nodes, and how this complies basically with the theories of subjectivation and individuation, or trans-individuation, if you want. And she also makes comparisons, for example, that when we are holding a smart device, or when we are like operating with a screen, we are actually because we are like focusing our attention onto these items, we are like within our own space of attention. So she's trying to describe like she's trying to see how this kind of, these digital networks maybe still take up a certain kind of space. So they're not like merely like immaterial, or just immersed in like flows of information and data, but they do spatialize in a sense. And then she also brings in other readings of the monad, also with Hard and others, which do kind of introduce like the notion of an inside and an outside, or like a window to the monad, which then kind of here, for instance, if on the inside the monad represents the simplicity and closure of the soul which reads the world, its outside corresponds to an infinitely divisible visual ideal, where indivisibility is displaced by an infinitely divisible individual acting like a node or a relay in a collective represented by an image, by the image of the network. So it's kind of like she's in her text also, she's constantly like this folding in and folding out, which is something that Deleuze brought in to like the reading of the monad. Nomad. Yes. Hold on. So I recommend everyone to read the text, because it's complicated if you don't know Leibniz before, and the reading, the line of thought behind it. Yeah, I don't know if I should go like much further into it, but she basically tries to work with this neo-monadological model of social cooperation as maybe something of a way to understand how communication actually works within digital networks. And hold on.
It seems like the image of the monad brings up this question of narcissism as well, that we'll talk about with McLuhan.
Oh yeah, for sure. Which is interesting, because she starts from the monad, and then she goes to Deleuze with the fold, which kind of like enables like this like I don't know if capture makes sense, because, and then she basically goes on with like the option of the monad has a window. So it's kind of like well, like what are we like, I don't know. It's just like I find it really interesting, like to trace like this genealogy. But I also was wondering, okay, what is the difference between the models? And the only like thing that I found like interesting or convincing, or where I thought, okay, well, this is something to hold on to, is not so much like if the monad has a window, or if it's folded, or if it's like completely if they're supposedly like in the model, in this like idea, if there's like an opening or something, but that there is like a form of communication which maybe also works with resonance, or in whichever kind of way. But for me, it was much more, hey, the very fact that it takes up the space, that the whole fact is it's not a point, it takes up space. So the forms of communication can be any, or the model can be any, but the whole point of taking up the space, I thought was like much more important. Funny enough, because if you speak about digital networks taking up space, even on a kind of a level of recognition or something like that, in terms of attention and intentionality, maybe also. And this I found rather maybe helpful to create or construct something from that. And I mean, she concludes basically. She also speaks about the social as that which is transferable, right? So maybe for me it's not so much about like if it's a window or how it is transferred, but there is the fact that something transfers, like in which ways. Well, how it's theorized, I don't know. Maybe that doesn't really matter so much, but she basically concludes with that neuromonology of social memory production is a speculative experiment that allows us to understand ordinary events of social memorialization in network cultures as an expression of social cooperation that breaks the theories of motivation and the harmonization of individual choices entailed by concepts of social law, but also of emergence. And I thought it was kind of interesting because on the one hand, she is against like this harmonizing model. So she is so that would mean for me, okay, conflict, open for conflict, or entailing or incorporating conflict into like this model. But then if she's also against emergence, then this is something I couldn't really fully follow up with, like what that really means. And again, like the whole article is very dense. But I wish I'm sure, or I hope that maybe there's another article where she goes more into detail into like what this means, like on a maybe political level. I don't know if you can, if there is. I haven't looked into other work. Maybe you can comment on that.
Yeah.
Jason, could you also say a little bit more about how you think the idea of the monad connects to McLuhan's idea of narcissism?
Yeah. Well, I mean, for Leibniz, the monad is without windows and is kind of a self-enclosed world in a way. Whereas I think for Deleuze kind of alters that, and it seems that she's following Deleuze's reading primarily of Leibniz. Is monad related to a tetrad? No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that I would want to critique neomonadology as another ruse of microeconomics, which is beleaguered and has to start from the methodological individualism to construct its world and introduce some phantasm of the social, or phantasmagoria in the social, some sort of thin version. Now remember that in classical economics with Adam Smith and so forth, it was a macroeconomics that looked at the whole of society, land, labor, and so forth, and tried to decide how everybody got their various shares. But round about the time where socialism was making headway, as there was some disagreement about the shares, there was a switch to neoclassical economics in the 1870s or so in various countries, which started from individuals and their tastes or their preference or their needs or so forth. It's variously phrased, and attempts to construct the whole of economic life from that, from the various exchanges, and attempts to prove that in a certain way everybody gets what satisfies their needs. There's a Pareto optimum. If one good is too expensive, there's the substitute good that you can work for it. And this model has been critiqued. It's obviously totally inadequate. And so there have been attempts to kind of expand it by introducing institutions and other things into it. Now, the traditional kind of monadology approach to Spinoza is the notion that they're windowless and that they're subject to this prearranged harmony. So in essence, they don't have to interact with one another. You know, it seems like they are, but it's a pre-established harmony that's established by God in the best of all possible worlds, which of course sounds like the invisible hand, where all of these people who are interacting together on the market, unbeknownst to each other, unaware of each other, whose only relation is between themselves and the good that they're after, which produces a desire in them. In other words, they're not looking at what other people have out of envy and saying, I want that. They're looking only at the good and say, this is my need, I'll pay $30 for it or $50 for it. You know, that in other words, we have the original Leibnizian notion, which is close to the Smithian notion of the invisible hand. Now, almost all of the kind of complexity theories, the wisdom of crowds, the networks, appeal to what classical economics assumes, that there's something natural about trucking and bartering, or that if you let things happen, what happens uncoordinated by other individuals is something great that comes together. And this is Hayek's notion of the market as some sort of incredible mind that makes the best decision of itself that is far better. So coming from the left and from a time that any kind of sort of organization has status organization has been denigrated, it's very, very hard to look at this as a direction that can lead to something that we can use. Admittedly, we all want to find some sort of social community arising out of this heavily kind of monetized space, and there is a community. I mean, the fact that we're here is proof of it. But I don't think the neo-monadology theory, as it's put forward by Gabriel Tardet, gives us a kind of a picture of what we're doing and what we're trying to do or what we're trying to break out of. I don't know if you know Tardet, but this whole attempt to devise this kind of infinite number of tastes that people have that are somehow met in this form of sociology comes very, very close to a woman called Virginia Postrel, who has a notion called The Substance of Style, a book, and a number of others, who's one of the defenders of a new kind of capitalism, which basically says, basically now you collaborate with companies to get exactly the product that you want. They ask you to design it themselves. You could go online and say, I want it in blue, and I want it in this, and so forth. So we're approaching a kind of harmony where individual needs are met together by companies that are continually adapting to them. And I find that Tardet and also Bruno Latour, who is the guy who has promoted Tardet again as a kind of a solution to the state versus the individual problem, or the networks and actor networks, with his idea that, no, there's no such thing as capitalism, there are all these kind of capitalisms, is a form of an absolute denial as to what exactly is going on here. So I think we all want the sociology. We're not throwing the future of networks out of the window, but this is not the theory that is going to do it for us, because it seems to it seems in denial about all the things that Marxism has revealed about how capitalism monetizes and circulates, or what its needs are as opposed to our needs.
Yeah. Well, this is good preparation for the 12th when she will speak about both of these articles. So maybe try and read them one more time before we have that meeting, and come up with 2 to 3 questions each person if you can, or even just points that you want to share or whatever, and that'll be really interesting. So thanks a lot, Manuela. It was good.
Yes.
So let's maybe move on to. So I just posted on here that Deleuze alters Leibniz's concept of the monad with his concept of the nomadic monad, which is exactly like what it sounds like. It's an open concept of the monad, as opposed to a completely self-enclosed one. And of course, for the nomadic for Deleuze is right, exactly. He's buggering Deleuze.
I just wanted to interject the one thing that I just noticed that Leibniz might have been buggering Bruno. Giordano Bruno, whom she mentions briefly, and so there's many concepts of the monad going on here, and I love the fact that she's reappropriating it. I don't quite get it, but I just wanted to respond to Philip a little bit, and just for me, there's a great deal of value in the monad as an alternative and not quite a positivist or mechanistic model of material relations, I guess.
Yeah, for me too. I read the monadology in grad school, and I really liked it. It didn't fit my way of thinking about the world, but was really compelling, I thought.
And I wonder about the Latour connection that you made, because the monad, the non-extension, the no windows, the no doors, it kind of reminds me of Graham Harman thing of firewall. All these objects are firewalled, and this being part of this movement of so-called speculative realism that kind of captured a lot of people's imaginations. I'm wondering if what this essay has to do with that. If anybody has any thoughts. Maybe I didn't phrase the question correctly.
Could you state it one more time?
About the idea that objects in the world are firewalled, like there's no communication, there's no relation between them. I think I might have misunderstood Graham Harman's claim about that, and I think it was connected with Latour, and I didn't quite follow it at the time, but it did remind me of the monadology, and so I was intrigued.
Yeah, well, it seems like kind of a Kantian question too. Theodore just mentioned Wolfendale. Theodore, do you want to say what you're going to say there about Wolfendale? Because I'm betting it has to do with Kant. The whole phenomenon-noumenon relation, where we don't really have access to objects. Objects are, it's kind of like what I was saying the other day about what cinema does. Cinema makes things visible or perceptible to us that in many more dimensions than we can experience in our bodies. Like as embodied subjects, I have this laptop in front of me. I'm looking at it, but I'm only seeing the front part of the laptop, the keyboard, but I'm not seeing the back of it right now. So that the back part of the object, even though it's right in front of me, is not perceptible to me. So it remains withdrawn. Unless I could get a 3D rendering of it, and even if I did get a 3D rendering of it, and I could spin that rendering around, at any moment that I'm looking at one side of the laptop, I'm not seeing the other side. So I don't know for sure what's happening on the other side at the moment that I'm not looking at it. So there's this constant withdrawal of objects from our perception, arguably. And the only thing that could really, bring us closer to that is maybe technology. Something that renders visible what's not perceptible to us. Manuela, do you want to respond to what he said? I think he was responding to the way that you presented it.
You mean the question about Latour?
Yeah.
The withdrawal? I mean, the only thing I read was Harmon, when Harmon speaks about the cotton and what was it, the fire and the cotton, and they actually don't really touch and so on and so forth. And he, I think it was in reassembling the political, where Harmon comments on, was it Harmon, where Harmon comments on Latour. I haven't really read so much that part. I was more into the Dewey part, but yeah, like the whole thing. If you think about I mean, the monad, or the whole concept of the the withdrawal, that you cannot really, like, you can never really access, fully access an object or something like that. I mean, yeah, I mean, what can you say? Like, yeah, um, that is kind of like a monadological concept. But I think Harmon, if you want to know more about Harmon, Harmon has like these two level, like he introduces like these two levels. Like, I think he thinks it on the level of the real, and then he thinks it on the sensual kind of like real objects and sensual objects. So he kind of like almost tries to, um, in order to overcome uh, this kind of discrepancy, like he introduces the sensual, which is kind of like almost um, that which is mediating or something, if you want. I mean, this is maybe really reductive, and I would have to read it again, but this is something where I could see like some sort of connection, or in terms of, like, when we talk about communication or perception, and the accessibility, or like the sort of, yeah, the possibility, maybe also in terms of to fully perceive, but also like to fully understand. I mean, these are like two different levels, which I would look at in terms of monadology, which I actually, is also actually something that I didn't really fully. I mean, she's more speaking about monadology, as far as I understand it, on a, I think, on a perceptual level. It's not so much in terms of not so much in terms of epistemology, and that's something. I mean, that's one of the questions I would probably have, like, for her, like, because she wasn't really going so much into detail in that respect. But yeah, that's what I can say right now. But this is lots of guessing, so I don't know if it helps.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're getting close to 7:30, which really should be our stop time, because that's 2.5 hours from when we pretty much began. So let me go through the other two readings. Okay, so the first one is McLuhan, and I would really encourage anyone who wants to write about automation. The chapter Automation, Learning and Living is really, really rich, and I found, I only gave it one read, but I found that if I wanted to write based on this, I would read it again at least once. It's pretty rich, and I think it could go pretty well with Chernyshek and Williams. The two chapters that I concentrated on was the automation chapter and the chapter The Gadget Lover, which weirdly coincided with Catherine Liu's piece on selfies, where she was kind of critiquing. You can see that post on my Facebook. It's my most recent one. But basically, what she was doing is, what she argues is that since World War II, I think what she's kind of implicitly doing here is kind of this history of the category of youth, which is a really interesting literature if you want to look at it in cultural studies, which basically argues that all the different subcultures that you can think of are all products of the birth of this category of youth, which had to do with the political economy of the post-World War II era, and various things like that. Whereas in the past, you were either basically you're either a child or an adult, more or less. There wasn't this separate category from mid-teens to mid-20s of youth, really, arguably in the past. And so she points out that the youth category and the subcultures and countercultures that came out of it in the post-war era, whether we're thinking of hippies or punks or whatever it might be, for the most part they used music. It was usually music that was the heart of the counterculture, and so rock music or maybe hip hop or various other types of music formed this distinction between the youth culture and the rest of the world, and was definitely opposed to the rest of the world. Whereas today we have, today this is my personal reading of what she's saying. In my view, we are post-subcultural now. We don't really have countercultures and subcultures, at least not in the way that we used to. Primarily because everything kind of bleeds into everything else. And if I hear about a new music genre, for example, that comes out, I can instantly go to Wikipedia, learn everything about it, skim through the top, the top recordings very quickly through YouTube and things like that. Somebody's microphone is hissing, so I'm going to turn it down. Okay. I can very easily just go learn about any subculture very, very quickly in this time, and so can anybody else. So you could, if you were interested in some subculture, you could go do that. And so most people today, even if they are interested in kind of alternative genres of music and things like that, are not really into just one type of music, and therefore there is no solid subculture in the way that there used to be. And so Catherine Liu taught a class on selfies, and she raised the question of narcissism and whether it's accurate to really say that selfies are primarily about narcissistic people who just have no connection to the rest of the world and just are completely entranced by themselves. This is a very common criticism of millennials, of course, that we hear. I think it's a pretty ageist type of argument. But basically, she taught a class in which they didn't really start from any assumptions. They just had a conversation. So how do you use selfies? How does this person use selfies? If we go and look at different examples of how people take these selfie photos, how do they do it differently? How do they do it similarly? Is it really just narcissism, or is there more to it? And so one of the things that came out of her class was that it's definitely not just narcissism. It's not just self-commodification. There's other things going on there. And she argued that actually this is a way that people try to understand themselves and try to connect with other people. So the selfie is actually a connection in a way. And this could maybe link in with this idea of the monad and neo-monadology, I think. So she said, the article says something like, in other words, the communities of Twitter and Facebook are much like the communalistic societies of old, by which they're referring to communes, kind of hippie communes and that kind of thing. Rather than being narcissistic, selfies serve as a means for young people to communicate and express themselves with one another within these online communities. And the reason I started out with that is because the Gadget Lover starts with the myth of Narcissus. And in the myth of Narcissus, Narcissus, is looking into the pond or the water and falls in love with himself, right? But McLuhan goes out of his way to point out, the common interpretation that it's just about this character who falls in love with himself is actually wrong, and that's not at all what happens in the story. It's actually what Narcissus falls in love with is a reflection that he believes to be someone else. So it's not actually pure narcissism in the way that we think of it in a kind of colloquial way. It actually was an other-focused type of thing. So so when McLuhan talks about this, he says the point of this myth is the fact that men at once become fascinated by any extension of themselves in any material other than themselves. So that could be water, that could be a selfie, that could be all kinds of things. And he says that narcissus derives from narcosis, which is a numbing agent. And then he connects this to this theory of autoamputation that we've talked about briefly before. So that any extension of ourselves is an autoamputation, and the autoamputative power or strategy is resorted to by the body when the perceptual power cannot locate or avoid the cause of irritation. And this quote right here I thought was really, really useful. He says, we often create artificial situations that rival the irritations and stresses of real life under controlled conditions of sport and play. I think we can see that in flame wars on Facebook or in email. Maybe we don't really see flame wars in email nowadays because people hardly even use it. But on Facebook, we see these crazy flame wars just happening all the time. And you know, the way that I would think about this through what McLuhan is saying here is that these are controlled conditions. This is a form of play, even though it can be very, very stressful sometimes when these things flare up. But this is part of this process of autoamputation. So his idea of gadgets, the function of any gadget really is obviously, like with any of his other examples, is an extension of the self, but it also has to do, in the case of gadgets specifically, I think McLuhan is really emphasizing that there is this relationship to the self in the gadget. So your iPhone, you feel personally connected to your laptop. You know, if something happens to your laptop, it's very traumatic to you, not just because you lose a lot of things, but because, you know, this was something that was close to you and was kind of part of you for an extended period. So I think there's a lot of interesting things that could be brought up there about narcissism and monadology. Does anybody want to say anything about that? Any feedback on that?
I mean, nothing that. Sorry, what's that feedback?
I don't know.
I keep on hearing a weird echo when I talk.
Oh.
Are other people hear that?
I'm not hearing it. But I'll mute my microphone because that might be the reason.
Okay. Yeah, I don't have anything that to say about it, but it is really fascinating interpretation. I don't know. I just find the narcissist myth really fascinating in general. I always find it pretty interesting, and it's really interesting that you know, that even if you are taking the myth in its original interpretation of fell in love with himself, even the falling in love with yourself requires a sort of a self-displacement or auto-imputation, because the you doing the loving and you being loved by yourself can't be completely identical. So yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think it's maybe a good way to come back at the argument that selfies are just about millennial narcissism or something like that. Is first of all to say in the original myth, Narcissus is not even falling in love with himself anyway, at least to his knowledge. That's not what he thinks he's doing.
Yeah.
And even if he was, as you said, that still involves some process of self-othering. And,
right.
And even when you think of a selfie, you're creating a version of yourself, right? Like you're putting
right.
up an image that is not necessarily you, as in the noumenal you,
right?
But is a constructed you, a version of you, and that is not simply that's not simply self-absorption. That's arguably also self-creation.
Right. I mean, especially when people post their selfies on social media, it's also here it's it's kind of you're saying, like, here I am. So, like, or I don't even know. It's a really kind of weird, unique form of sociality that I'm not sure if has really happened before.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't know if in the past there'd be any kind of context in which, like, because people have always, like, like wealthy royalty have had, like, paintings done of themselves and that kind of thing. But I don't know, just in terms of it being, like, a picture of oneself being, like, sort of a social, like, inherently social thing is just really, like, weird. I mean, it's interesting, and I think it's good, but it's hard to know really sort of what to say about it, because I just feel like it's so different from.
Right, and it's something that you're putting out there. You're putting it into
right, yeah.
public realm, so that's a little bit different too.
Yeah.
Philip made a point earlier. Can there be a society of monads? Or if we were to use Max Stirner, who's a great thinker, in my opinion, he has a book called The Ego and Its Own. If we were to use Stirner talks about a union of egoists. So that this would be a type of collectivity that does not deny the singularity of its participants. So it's not as though singularity or even individuality has to be opposed to collectivity or to communality,
right,
either.
Right.
But I guess it depends on the nature of the socius.
Right. Philip, would you mind explaining your idea of the Society of Monads a little more?
No, say it again, Adam. Explaining my idea of the Society of Monads.
Of your idea of the. Yeah. I might not have been here for when you.
No, I mean, I didn't explain it. I just put a little note on that. It was sort of ironic. I guess what I'm saying is, one way people have tried to overcome the self and other notion is not just the dividual, but the trans-individual, which Jason Reed writes about now, which is a way of saying that we exist somehow to the extent that I understand it, it comes from Simon Dunn, and I'm giving this third hand, is that we exist in between ourselves and others. The trans-individual part that we belong to, it kind of precedes us, and all these elements surrounds us. And, I wonder if it's just another way of rephrasing the notion of the social. In a time when the social post-Thatcher has had a hard time smuggling itself into any discussion after we hear that there's no such thing as society. Maybe all this is a more precise way of framing the social. Maybe it's a justified caution after the excesses of collectivism in the 20th century, that we're trying to allow it to come back in while still preserving a space for ourselves. I don't know, but it's. I guess what I'd say is the same thing I say about neoclassical economics. Microeconomics is not the point to begin, starting from the individual. Methodological individualism is not the point to begin to discuss either all of society, economic, transaction economics as a whole, or so forth. And it may be that the monad is not the point to begin discussing society. So that's all I'm saying. I understand that it's an attempt to preserve singularity, to add relation to a Leibnizian notion that seems to preclude substitutes pre-established harmony for relation. So my only philosophical question is, why sort of take something that was designed to eliminate relation and put relation back in, but still preserve it? I'm just asking, what does the move mean that we want to start from monads?
at this.
Can I interject something here? I think I might feel a little discomfort at conflating monad with atom, the Lucretian atom, the smallest unit of matter, uh, which in chemistry, or rather in physics, comes in with a pre-established harmony. But a monad seems to me to be a completely different model, more like this Narcissus, this Max Stirner ego in his own, a way of sort of non-relational relationality, I guess, seems to be where we're kind of going. And I think that in your last couple sentences, Jason, I was thinking back on the Shapiro essay, which I objected to the notion of the individual musicians kind of forming a collective musical language, which is more or less based on this music of resistance, the blues, which is commendable, but it kind of followed this sort of melting pot or atomistic model, these atoms forming this matter. Whereas I think that in jazz music, there are examples of musicians who are creating a kind of monadological model, like preserving like a total singular way of playing and of a practice. You know, a practice that could never be transmitted to somebody else, but it can be done at the same time as other people, or kind of shared somehow, but without really compromising the individuality, I guess. I'm still looking for the words.
The reason I hesitate to use the word individual, or why is just because I agree with the trans individual argument, which is that from Simondon, which is that the individual is only is really only in the relationship between others and the self. So there is no pure individual. So it's just that I'm trying to avoid the kind of liberal individual subjectivity, basically.
Yeah, I take your point, Ivan. Clearly, the monad is something more complex than an atom. But again, I'm still wondering for what this complexity. Why not, as Jason just said, say that the individual as such is a fiction, and that we really exist in that interspace, that the relationality between what used to be called the individual and the social space. What is the monad trying to bring to the discussion that this doesn't? That's all I'm asking. I realize I tend to take it as an atom, and since I am so constitutionally opposed to atomic liberalism with all its self-contracting atoms who form society and so forth, it doesn't immediately say, oh, this is something I want to embrace. But, you know, Deleuze has a way of making anything enthralling and interesting and kind of bending it back in the other direction. But at the end of the day, you know, I mean, keep asking, all right, you've made Nietzsche into Spinoza, but do we really need to do, you know, that's my, those are my reservations.
We should probably move on to the next reading. So I'm going to go through this one a little more quickly. So this last one is automation learning a living, and he's doing kind of a quip here from earning a living to learning a living. So he actually has quite a bit to say about education here and the relationship between automation and education, which made me think of the New Center a lot and some similar initiatives that are out there. And he talks about how with the rise of the automobile and of the highway and that kind of thing, the era of the one-room schoolhouse pretty much came to an end because when you didn't have great mobility, everyone kind of had to be in the same schoolhouse, and you would have all the different grades and all the different subject matter all kind of mixed together. But then the automobile came along, exploded that, and now we have a much more complex education system with highly specialized disciplines and different grades, and the different grades don't talk to each other, or they're not they're not in the same classroom anyway, and that kind of thing. So for him, this goes back to the automobile and the highway and roads and that kind of thing. He says automation is not just dissolving jobs and complex roles. For centuries, there was a stress in pedagogy in the arrangement of data, and these things now end with the instantaneous retrieval of information made possible by electricity. I mean, the way he talks about this, the instantaneous retrieval of information made possible by electricity, I mean, he's writing this so long ago, and it sounds as though he's talking about the internet. But really, if you really pay close attention to media history, television was also instantaneous, and so was radio. So were a lot of technologies. So instantaneous retrieval of information made possible by electricity means that this specialization that emerged from the rise of transportation technologies and the different means of traversal that went along with that is now being kind of destroyed, and we're kind of going back to the era of the one-room schoolhouse, where the different disciplines actually are mingled. And somewhere in here he says, let me find it real quick. Okay, he says, towards the end, he says, our education has, he says, okay, with electric technology, new kinds of instant interdependence and interprocesses take over production and also enter the market and social organizations. For this reason, markets and education designed to cope with the products of servile toil and mechanical production are no longer adequate. So in other words, there was a type of education that went along with the industrial era, and so the rise of electric communication and instantaneous communication means that that we can't really do that anymore. Our education has long ago acquired the fragmentary and piecemeal character of a mechanism. It's now under increasing pressure to acquire the depth and interrelation that are indispensable in the all-at-once world of electric organization. So, and he says, paradoxically, automation makes liberal education mandatory. So, so in other words, and we've heard people saying this, that, for example, that as all of these jobs disappear due to automation, who are going to be the kind of the new rising class, and this, according to McKinsey work, is going to be the vectoral class. Which could also be described as those who have an all-round education, a well-rounded liberal education that allows them to kind of run the machines and to kind of organize the rest of the world that used to have to be organized by people with highly specialized knowledge. After automation, maybe we don't need the same degree of specialized knowledge. He says, electric means of storing and moving information with speed and precision make the largest units quite as manageable as the small ones. The automation of a plant or an entire industry offers a small model of the changes that must occur in society from the same electric technology. And total interdependence is the starting fact. So, so what he's saying is that, there's no way that automation will not mean that only something, you'll automate, I don't know, here in Grand Rapids we have Herman Miller, which is a furniture factory. So let's say you automate Herman Miller. Well, that's not going to work unless you automate a lot of other businesses too. So what it's going to result in, according to him, is total universal interdependence of all processes, and that being due ultimately to electricity and to the. So maybe what Chernyshek and Williams are talking about really goes back well before the current era and isn't really reducible to the internet per se. The internet is itself a kind of necessary consequence of the fact of electricity and of the fact of the changes in media history in general well prior to it. He ends by saying, persons grouped around a fire or candle for warmth or light are less able to pursue independent thoughts or even tasks than people supplied with electric light. In the same way, the social and educational patterns latent in automation are those of self-employment and artistic autonomy. Throughout this, the figure of the artist comes up a lot, and it kind of reminded me of something that Muhammad once said, which is Mo thinks that the role of the art, or the life role of the artist, as not really being employed per se by anyone, but kind of being also at the same time sort of subservient to the whole political economy of art production and consumption and distribution, is the model for the rest of society as it is emerging right now. So in the same way, the social and educational patterns latent in automation are those of self-employment, artistic autonomy. Panic about automation as a threat of uniformity on a world scale is the projection into the future of mechanical standardization and specialism, which are now past. So, in other words, for McLuhan, we shouldn't assume that automation necessarily means uniformity. Actually, this fear of this sort of mass homogenization due to automation is really just a holdover from the industrial era. 'Cause it was really the industrial area that created mass uniformity, that created nation states, for example, and that kind of thing. Whereas what we're heading into now will be highly non-standard, he thinks. And in terms of people's knowledge base, we're going to see less and less specialization and expertise and more kind of liberal in the good sense, meaning interdisciplinary, basically. Interdisciplinary liberal education is what he thinks will come out of this.
It is also. Sorry, I'm hearing the echoing there. All right. It's also interesting that he's predicting this back then, just because I feel like people still have a lot of anxiety about a really like antiseptic mass homogenization from automation. I mean there are as we were talking about before with the Cyranek and Williams. I mean there are a lot sort of more disreputable reasons that people and owners of capital are opposed to it, but I think that a lot of people are still opposed to it.
I think you cut out at the end there.
You're saying that I just think reason. I just think a lot that that a lot of people are still opposed to it for that reason. Even, McLuhan probably thought that maybe it would have been long for that anxiety at this point in history right now, but for whatever reason, I think it's still a concern regarding automation, even now.
To me, it's kind of like globalization. Like when you think of, for example, the image of the United Nations or of a world government, people always seem to think that that anything global means, any type of global entity will mean that all local and unique cultures and communities and things like that will suffer under it. But if you look at the history of like Scotland, for example, when they were pushing for independence from the UK, their first goal was to try to go through the EU. Because they thought, well, this is a larger entity; it's bigger than the UK. Maybe we would have more freedom and autonomy as a people under the EU rather than under the UK, because the UK treats us as colonial subjects. Similarly,
Right.
in Hawaii, when I lived there, the Hawaiian independence movement had a lot of different fragments and a lot of different permutations, and one of them that actually became pretty much the most prominent one was one that argued for decolonization of Hawaii via the UN and via international law, because Hawaii was an independent nation state prior to even Germany, I believe, was the example that they used. Hawaii was an independent nation state before many nation states in the world. So at least in their case specifically, going to the global level to demand the right to break away from the U.S. is exactly, at least according to that argument, is exactly the right way to go. So I think similarly when we think about automation, that yes, there are fears about homogenization and fears that that sort of thing will transpire, but I think McLuhan's maybe right here in thinking that actually, it might free up people to stop living in this industrial era. I mean, I think that's one thing when you read Chernyshek and Williams, they're basically arguing that we're undergoing a worldwide deindustrialization. So this, including, as Daniel was talking about in third world countries where there's premature deindustrialization, because there is no way for an industrial proletariat to be formed, really. So as a result of that, you just have this on again, on again, off again production system where people living in rural areas are kind of forced into the cities. They work briefly and then they go back, and then they come back to the city, and then they go back to the rural area. You can't create an industrial proletariat like that without having industrial cities and without having permanent industrial populations. So instead of that, what we're seeing is a global deindustrialization, which doesn't mean that there's no technology or anything like that. It just means deindustrialization in the sense of an industrial economy that brings human beings into industry. Because now what we're seeing is automation. And so if people are freed from that, isn't it possible that would be exactly what would allow for more independence and self-determination? I think so, personally.
I mean, it's a matter of order too, like self-determination. In the case of some nations, they might choose to not industrialize. And I'm thinking of, situations where there's for example, hydroelectric dam going in, and those who are sovereign to that area will block the road or try to prevent that from happening.
Right.
Yeah, they don't need to be industrialized in order to make that move.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, I'm not sure how that would connect with. I mean, I guess these are terms like industrialization, deindustrialization, but it seems to me like they're trying to argue that the world as a whole is undergoing a process of deindustrialization,
Right.
and that even though it sounds like that's at odds with automation, to them somehow it's not at odds with automation. Because to them automation is one of the driving forces behind deindustrialization, I believe. But I don't know. I might need to go back and look at it.
I think so too, and I don't want to keep hammering on this thing about monadology. It's just captured my imagination so much in this session here, but I think this is something that's at stake there, which is the non-lineality of the communication, of the so-called action at a distance under Leibniz or Giordano Bruno's monad, which would allow for the kind of independence that sidesteps the globalization, or rather the industrialization, a globalization that would take place without the linear movement of history towards that.
Yeah, I haven't read Bruno, but it sounds interesting. Is Bruno like at odds with Leibniz then, or?
I haven't read the monad in Bruno, so okay. I just know him as a more mystical philosopher, Neoplaton. Okay. But he speaks a lot about action at a distance, but that's basically synonymous with magic for him. But something like television, just the very words television is vision at a distance.
Right.
And I think of, actually I was thinking of the Hindi. In India they have Doordarshan, it's a television station, which is vision from afar. Darshan is vision, so that kind of like tripped me out until I realized like television is the exact same word. So
yeah,
it has something to do with that, and I guess even though I don't, I know there's a lot, people mean a lot of different things by mysticism, but I think that's basically what visionary it is.
Yeah.
So we could be talking about completely different kind of communication using the model of monad other than the sort of atomistic or mechanical type of model.
Right. Absolutely.
And I think we're there, honestly, under both. I mean, quantum physics has kind of got that to it too. The whole quantum entanglement thing is kind of monadistic.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's very interesting. Daniel, do you want to say anything, by chance, about the deindustrialization or any of that? No, I can't hear you. Okay. All right. Well, well, we can discuss more in the chat and that kind of stuff. Let's maybe just so we don't have the same confusion for next week, let's figure out who's going to talk about what. So for next week we have Lev Manovich, Database as Symbolic Form, Davide Panagia on Data Politic, Sadie Plant, Zeros and Ones, and Paul Virilio, the Information Bomb. Manuela already called the Information Bomb. Who would like to do Lev Manovich? One benefit of doing this one is that all the talk that you hear about big data and rethinking media in terms of databases and that kind of stuff this is one of the key texts for it. Can we give hashtags? What do you mean?
Just like what types of interests might align with each one.
Oh yeah, sure. Okay, so so Manovich would be. I mean, I think Manovich would be very interesting for you, Theodore. Actually, it would be more useful for people who are kind of like starting from media studies or from design or something like that. And it's very influential text, very widely read and cited. And basically, what it's arguing is that we've moved from narrative form to the database. So you know, a lot of cultural studies analysis has been on film, literature, fiction, and things like that. And he's saying that we're moving into, as we move into the era of the database, or of data in general. Now he's working on big data, but this was before that. But as we move into the era of data, there's a new type of symbolic form that emerges from that, and that's the database.
Yeah, I'll take that one.
Okay.
Sounds great.
Yeah, I think that's a good one for you.
Cool.
And then the next one is Davide Panagia on data politic, and he's basically doing, you know, to a large extent, the same type of thing that Manovich is doing in media studies in political theory. And this is an ongoing project of Davide's. He's on Facebook. If you're not friends with him, I would recommend becoming friends with him. Lev Manovich is also on Facebook, if you didn't know that. But Davide Panagia is one of the few political theorists who is really trying to take post-digital technology seriously, and specifically computation and cybernetics and data. Is that of interest to anybody?
I can take that on.
Okay. Sadie Plant, Zeros and Ones. Sadie Plant is, she's from the CCRU, which is where Nick Land was, you know, back when, in the 90s and that kind of stuff. And she was kind of like the feminist accelerationist, the original feminist accelerationist, or at least one of them. She's probably the most well-known and most prominent of them from that era. It's a really, really interesting book about, basically deals with how computation is based in zeros and ones, and computers are based on that. She relates zeros and ones to gender, and talks about kind of suppressed feminist histories of the emergence of computers and of other technologies like that. And it has that kind of playful type of writing that you find in Nick Land as well.
I'd be into taking that on.
Okay. Great. All right, then we are covered. See you guys next week.
See you then.
See you. Thanks a lot.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.